I'd like to go on now and talk about our keynote speaker. And in your program, you may have seen that Diane Moss was originally scheduled to appear. And you know, this has been a horrible flu season on the mainland, and she did have a last-minute cancellation from illness. But I've got to tell you, I am so glad that Chris Lee is going to be speaking this morning. And I don't need notes to talk about Chris Lee, because I can tell you that as we were developing this program, we would continue to find areas where we thought we were very cutting edge. So carbon farming is a great example. You know, we'd been doing research, you know, what's going on in the field, and we were very excited because we thought we were going to be the first forum to really talk about carbon farming. And what did we find? We found that Representative Lee had set up a carbon farming task force the year before. And so as we went and did this, we found again and again that Chris Lee has been really the Hawaii leader on carbon regulation, carbon emissions, and as the head of the House Committee on Energy and Environment, he's really in a position to help steer the discussion, you know, and the agenda. So I just wanted to say that, number one, we very much appreciate Representative Lee coming and speaking this morning, but more importantly, I cannot imagine a better person as far as a homegrown vision here in Hawaii of what we should be doing on climate, what we should be doing on carbon. So anyway, with that, I am so glad to welcome to the stage Representative Chris Lee. Thank you. Yeah.
Good morning. Let me begin by saying, for those in the audience, I'm going to be drinking out of a bottled water. While not the most sustainable, I just really don't want to spill it on my laptop. So please give me that deference. Secondly, thank you so much. That is perhaps the most remarkable introduction I've had, and while I certainly I think have yet to live up to anything of the sort, I will say it's great to be here, and I do feel uniquely qualified to talk about carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases because I come from the state capital, where there's a lot of that on a regular basis. Obviously, I think as has been pointed out, I'm not Diane Moss. But I know Diane Moss, and we've worked together on a number of projects and initiatives in the past, as well as that are ongoing right now, and she is remarkable in the effort that her team and a lot of the partners that they've pulled together have been able to achieve in states around the country and around the world is remarkable. And I do hope there's an opportunity to hear some of the stories that she can share. Let me begin by saying when we talk about carbon and talk about greenhouse gases and all the rest of it, from the perspective and context that we have here in Hawaii, I think we really got to step back a little bit, and that's what I want to do just for a minute. And so I want to start here. This is a Facebook post. If anybody's online on a regular basis, you see these things coming from politicians all the time. And it's very much reaching out to your constituents and reaching out to the community, talking about what you're doing, kind of waving your flag around. But there's something else that's really valuable in that. As much as we hate getting that kind of stuff, and even me, from my colleagues in my social media feed on a regular basis, it becomes a little bit competitive. And so when we talked about what was happening in other places around the world as it relates to renewable energy and carbon, we had met and worked with a lot of leaders in other places. In this case, in California with State Senator and Senate Pro Tem Kevin De Leon, who's been a champion for climate action, for renewable energy, for pushing the envelope in their state. And a lot of the policies, a lot of the infrastructure and funding that's been pouring into the Energy Commission and their CPUC, and certainly the policies that have been passed have been a direct result of his action. And so when we met, this was back in 2015 for the first time, we had just in Hawaii passed our 100% RPS, and California was just at the tail end of passing theirs. And we had a great discussion in his office, and ultimately, they ended up passing a 50% by 2030 target, which is actually about the exact same trajectory as our 100% by 2045, but ours is just a little bit further out. And so, in the spirit of competitive jockeying and trying to outdo each other to do a good thing, we took this picture, and I ended up posting this on Facebook. I added in the text there, and I tagged him. And so on their end, they were on the receiving end of this. And while what's been done is amazing, 100% looks better than 50, I think. And so I got a couple emails. But suffice it to say, it's the kind of competitive, I think, spirit and drive that really is behind a lot of what we're seeing in a lot of these states that are starting to act on these sorts of things. And I want to return to this in just a minute, because it's the start of a story. But in the meantime, let me move on to, here in Hawaii, obviously, when we talk about our long-term goals, our long-term vision for both renewable energy, for the kind of economy that we want to have for clean energy, and ultimately, what we're going to be passing on to our kids, we really, I think, have to bring it back to those values, the community, all the things that for us matter. And for almost every presentation I've given in the last few years, I've always started with this slide, because ultimately this is, well, for me, in self-interest, this is the district I represent, and I'm incredibly fortunate to represent, but it's also the place that I grew up. And it's amazing that we wake up every day in this kind of environment here, surrounded by the resources such as the sun, such as the ocean and wind and everything else that we can harness and take advantage of. And I think that's an important second part of the story that I want to return to in just a minute. But in the meantime, we've, for the last 3 years at this conference and many others, been focused on 100% renewable energy, or RPS, the mechanisms and somewhat policies that have helped get us here this far. And for us, that's fantastic. But ultimately, what it's meant is we've come this far. And so we're, of course, now at roughly 28% renewable energy on the whole as a state, on our path toward our 2020 target, and then eventually on to 100%. That's something which I think we owe a great deal of gratitude to all the stakeholders who've made that possible. It sounds easy, it sounds great. Oh yeah, we doubled our renewable production here in Hawaii in the last decade. No problem. But obviously it was a bit more complicated than that. I take no credit for it. I think it's the engineers and the technical folks and the developers and the financiers who've made these projects possible that really are the ones driving that conversation. This is a picture of a project on Kauai, which I think many people are familiar with. It's a project that's been around now for a few years and has been real-world tested, PV plus storage, to be able to show that not only can you integrate this kind of setup successfully on an electric grid, but you can do it with results that far surpass anything which has been expected, to be able to get in front of the kinds of brownouts, blackouts, and trips that potentially in the past have caused problems. And that's savings on a whole new order of magnitude, not only to a utility, but of course to the entire community, to the economy as we move forward. And I bring this up because on our path toward 100% renewable energy, coming where we're at 28% roughly right now, I think there's a number of folks I've seen in the audience who are with us, thanks to AES and HECO and a number of other companies that have launched projects and finally put shovels in the ground in just the past month or so. HECO's got 114 megawatts over 3 projects that are about to get underway and hopefully will be online shortly. We were just about a week, maybe 2 weeks ago, over at KIUC, and they say this is a 28 megawatt solar, 100 megawatt hour battery project, which is certainly the largest on the island. I haven't been able to verify this, but it is possible for a short period of time this will be the largest project on the planet. And this is happening not only here in Hawaii, but on Kauai, an island of decent size, but the kind of place where you can walk down the street, you know every single neighbor, and it's the kind of community that can absolutely take advantage of this and is leading the way. It's not a giant Los Angeles or New York or other metropolitan area. It's here. And that's impressive because it means that if we can do this here, it can be done anywhere. We've got about a third of our homes in the state now that have some sort of rooftop PV or other sort of solar hot water and so forth. That's rapidly been growing, as folks know. Last year, and I have minimal numbers here because I don't have the whole universe of numbers from all the developers, but we know there's at least about 60 megawatt hours of batteries that have been put into place in residences around the state, just pure residential. And think for a minute what that could mean once the PUC moves forward with the dockets that are before it, to be able to enable that kind of distributed storage to play a role with demand response or other things on the grid. It is game-changing once you start aggregating these kinds of resources. It creates new value for customers, it creates new value for us all, and it certainly reduces the kinds of fossil fuel necessary, which of course is putting greenhouse gases into our air. And so we've been trying to figure out how do we take these wins and amplify them toward this longer-term vision that we hold out there, that we're going to be talking about today. And at the legislature, we're right about halfway right now between January and May, which is our crazy season when everybody starts pulling their hair out, wondering what the heck we're going to do. But what we've done thus far, I think, is a demonstration of the kinds of genuine support from both the House, the Senate, and our colleagues in trying to push this conversation and trying to actually enable the people who are doing these kinds of projects and making this kind of progress in our utilities and around the state to actually be able to do it and to be able to accelerate that process. The PUC has been fantastic, moving along a number of dockets and volume that I certainly couldn't handle, focusing on DER and community storage, solar and wind and all the other things out there. We're trying to figure out on our end, how do we dovetail with that, not exactly knowing what the PUC is going to do, unless someone's going to be up here explaining that today. I have enough Randys in the audience. But so we've pushed forward thus far a fairly large bill, which has been around for a couple of years, focusing on how do we modify the incentives and the resources that we're giving to the community in the form of tax credits that have traditionally applied to mostly rooftop solar and wind and things like that, and really tweak it for the future. Now that we've hit this turning point where we know that storage is not only obviously the next step to incorporate into these sorts of designs, but also is financially viable in a way that it never was even 2 or 3 years ago. And so that bill's moving along. It is one of our priorities that we want to get to the end game and have the governor sign. But it's not the only one. And there's probably 3 or 4 other things that I think are equally important that comprise pieces of this puzzle this year. And so if I move on for a second, it was mentioned earlier that HCEI is at its 10th year. We had an anniversary with the governor at Washington Place, which was amazing because there were a lot of people who were actually there when this was originally put together, who are still involved and still pushing. And talking with some of them, it's clear that it's amazing how far we've come because a lot of people didn't think it was possible to achieve the original goals set out, but certainly not what we now have before us today. But what's also true that we realized was that with HCEI and all the other infrastructure that we have out there that's focused and targeted in on moving the ball in this front, we're starting to hit a glass ceiling. And it's not that we can't move forward, it's that we need to rethink the way we're approaching these things in order to make that possible. And the example that most clearly comes to mind is the lack of comprehensive approach to this overall question of energy, carbon, climate that has to this point been siloed. The Public Utilities Commission has had jurisdiction over largely the electricity sector in this discussion. The Department of Transportation and other similar agencies have had jurisdiction over transportation, which of course is a huge portion of this question. The Energy Office and HCEI and all the other stakeholders along the way have their pieces of the puzzle. And while there's overlap, everybody, I think to this point, has been really focused and rightly so, on doing their jobs and pushing as much as they can in their silos. So how do we now break that ceiling and bring those peoples to those agencies together and align everything that's being done much more efficiently and effectively? So this is something that we're looking at. We've got bills right now moving through the legislature, in addition to the tax credits I mentioned, which would broaden HCEI. And we've reached out and talked with a lot of stakeholders over the last about 5 or 6 months, trying to figure out, as we approach this 10-year anniversary, what do we do next? And how do we transition into a 2.0 phase that now aligns with our long-term planning that's broader than just electricity? And so one of these bills would basically rebrand HCEI no longer as the Clean Energy Initiative, but rather the Hawaii Clean Economy Initiative, to incorporate transportation, to incorporate all the different pieces of the puzzle that are out there, and more specifically, to bring into the fold a lot of the private sector stakeholders whom didn't even exist back when HCEI was first launched, and leverage those resources so that it's not just government, it's not just the folks at the state capitol and other places who are sort of at the core of this, but rather there's legitimate discussion and legitimate help so that we are actually following on what the private sector really wants to do. Because we're at a point where the economy is driving, technology is driving, and everybody knows it. Our policies are following that and catching up to that constantly. And that is a frustration, I think, that we hear from everybody. And I know there's a lot of projects that have been delayed as a result. There's a lot of good work that's been delayed. There's a lot of discussion that's been delayed because we simply cannot keep up with how fast and how amazing our technology and our private sector has been able to really leverage this sort of change for good. So for us, I think this is a discussion whose time has come to look at how we move HCEI forward. And the cool thing is, traveling around the country in other states and certainly other places, everybody's watching. Everybody knows that in their own jurisdictions, there is similar sorts of institutional inertia, not by design, but simply because a 20th century regulatory regime and traditional government and private sector roles no longer really apply in this 21st century space. So how do we retool? And there's so much excitement around the idea that, for once, people are going to address the economy as the economy, and clean energy and all the good things that come with it in that frame, rather than cherry-picking different pieces of the puzzle and letting them compete for what incentives or other attention they might otherwise get. And so there's a lot of folks who've been looking to make those kinds of investments here in Hawaii, because I think we're starting to think outside the box in that way. The other piece of the puzzle, of course, is transportation. And there's a lot we can say about transportation. There's a lot of graphs and charts and fancy things that we can pull out. I like this one simply because, oh wait, this is the wrong one. This is electricity. I meant to go through this one a few minutes ago. Okay, well, let's move on anyway. Transportation obviously comprises about 2/3 of our energy consumption, our fossil fuel consumption here in the state. We've had, for all the talk about EVs and everything else, and full disclosure, I don't drive an EV yet. I'd like to. I need a charging port somewhere where I can plug in since I park on the street. So hopefully we can get there. But we've had a lot of interest, obviously, but yet at the same time, the last 3 years, we've seen increasing gasoline sales in the state, which a lot of people, I think, aren't even aware of. But that is a trajectory which we need to change, because we can leverage those dollars into this better investment in clean transportation, reduce our carbon emissions, and all of that, and all the while create new jobs, create new opportunity, and that's something which is super exciting. Because EVs, frankly, for everybody from a consumer perspective, as we know, are cheaper to drive than gas cars, even today. And even some of the most conservative estimates from PricewaterhouseCoopers and Booz Allen and others clearly show that EVs, generally speaking, passenger vehicles, are going to be cheaper to produce within the next 5 to 7 years than gas cars. And the minute that happens, we're going to start to see not linear, but rather exponential adoption. And that's something we need to prepare for. How do we create that infrastructure and get past the chicken and egg syndrome where we have lots of EVs, but don't have the saturation of charging infrastructure, and vice versa? So we are obviously one small state and one place in that equation, but others are moving much more quickly. And for us, we know that, I put Tesla in here because it's just a sexy car. I don't have a Model 3 order in yet, but maybe someday. But for a lot of people, this is something which is real. And so you see other car manufacturers, of course, across the board, BMW, Toyota, Hyundai, and on and on and on. Everybody's moving in this direction right now. Companies like Volkswagen and others already making strong commitments as a private sector company to produce a focus on EVs or eliminate their internal combustion engine vehicles by such and such a date. But what's interesting from my perspective are the countries that are starting to do this too. To require sales of clean vehicles only, zero emissions vehicles. And they define it slightly differently, but in short, you've got these guys up. Their target's 2040. France, also 2040. Further down, India, 2030. And now you're starting to wonder, how real can this be, and how much of an impact is this going to have on the private sector auto manufacturers if now you're creating all these markets around the world that are going to require zero emissions vehicles in short order? And it's easy in some countries where you don't have an existing established broad market. India is a good example where you have a lot of disconnected cities and territories and so forth that don't rely on a lot of cars yet. But the market is there. And the size and sheer volume that people could be buying into in just a few years is astounding. Israel, 2030. Norway, 2025. That's supposed to say Netherlands, but it didn't fit, so I cut it down. But then, of course, the big daddy of them all, China, who's already committed to a zero emissions vehicle future. They have yet to put a date on it, but it's widely expected to be somewhere in the mix with all these other countries. And that's huge because they are going to eclipse very quickly the United States and our ability as consumers to influence where that market goes. And so where they go, clearly, is going to drive. And that's something which is really exciting because while the United States is not leading in this respect anymore in this particular space, it makes it all the easier for us to take action regardless. And that's the bottom line. So for us, it's not only about these manufacturers moving, but it's also in the transportation space, how we rethink transportation to begin with, or the need for it in the first place. You'd be surprised to find out, I certainly was, when I graduated from high school, and speaking of high schools, I'm going to put in a plug for Iolani. When I graduated from high school in 1999, 99% of my age group, 18 to 25, had driver's licenses here in Hawaii. Does anybody want to guess where that's at today? 18 to 25-year-olds in Hawaii. I know two of you at least know this answer out there. But the answer is not 99% anymore, it's 65%. And that is a change that is massive. I can't even begin to explain. An entire generation switching their lifestyle, their ability to participate in sort of the traditional expectations for transportation that we've all long thought were unchangeable. Couple that with automation, of course, and the impact it can have on our transportation system, which then goes to the impact, of course, that it has on the financing, the economy, and of course, most of all, emissions and fossil fuel consumption. And you're talking about radical change in just a handful of years, and that's something which we cannot ignore either. And in Hawaii, what's really exciting is there are folks who are ready to go for this. You know, some of our in our tourism sector, fleet vehicles with our rental car companies, are the large buses that drive folks around. They're waiting for this to happen. They're ready because it's a better product for them. It's a better way to sell the islands. It's better for business, and they want to make that investment. But we are competing. And as a country, we do have a lot of steps that we need to take to be able to keep up and get there. Clearly, China not only will drive this conversation, no pun intended, but also is doing it out of their own self-interest. We need to, as well, I think, keep that in mind. Because for us, we do have our own economic self-interest in this country that we need to protect. And that means being proactive. And that means going where the market is and trying to figure it out to get ahead of it. In Hawaii, what's been exciting as well is I have to give credit to our mayors. I don't know if Mayor Arakawa is here today or will be later, but all 4 of whom came together just a couple months ago and committed to 100% clean transportation by 2045 here in Hawaii. That is something which is unprecedented. And all credit goes to them because they're starting this on their own. And so for us at the state capitol this year, what we're looking at is ways we can help. What can we do to help move that needle? And so we've got a couple things that are moving along right now. The first being following up on their commitment to make our own. And we had a bill last year which almost made it. We've got one this year which I think has about 100% support at this point, or at least no opposition from anybody thus far, which would lay out the framework for a clean transportation future and establish a clean transportation initiative right here in Hawaii. And that's something which would require all public transportation to be renewable by 2035, following down and doubling down on the mayor's commitments. It would also set out benchmarks to reduce fossil fuel consumption in the transportation sector 10% by 2025 and establish further benchmarks as the market develops and we know what's really possible. And that's something which is exciting because it's something where everybody can finally agree. And we can come together and we know we have to put in EV infrastructure. We know we have to change the way we do things. We know we have to open up opportunities for investment. And really, we've got a lot of companies right now competing, private sector companies from not only the mainland but around the world to make investments in pilot projects and other projects of scale for the first time to prove these models work. And here in Hawaii, we're competing for those. And we've been, I think, one of the most ideal places because of our density and our size and our time that we've already committed to these sorts of things. And so this is something that I think we really got to double down on. We also are looking at extending the EV benefits out there beyond 2020. And so that's looking at some of the parking benefits and those sorts of things that EV owners currently get. And that's to incentivize their sale. Because we don't right now have the kinds of tax credits and other things that we're giving out like other states are. And finally, we just passed a bill. Actually, we will be passing a bill shortly. But we just voted it out of committee, which would require that 25% of all new stalls in multi-unit buildings be wired for electric vehicles. And that's something which is future-proofing our investments and making sure that people are going to have an opportunity to reduce costs through the use of electric vehicles and so forth. And lastly, let me return to sort of the original question here, which was not only how we get EV stalls, EV infrastructure in place and focus on transportation, but also come back to the broader question of marrying these sectors, transportation, electricity, and so on. And for us, I come back to this because when I was growing up here, this area right where this picture is was a beach. And it's now gone for a lot of reasons, but one of those reasons is certainly the acceleration of sea level rise, which is having an impact not only here, but around the state. We've since lost over 17 miles of beaches in recent decades. That number is expected to accelerate. It's a huge problem, and for us, one of the effects of climate change, which especially in a tourist-driven state, we can't ignore. The other portion of that, of course, which is really scary, is the disaster, hurricane, tsunami, all the other things which climate change is also affecting in some ways. Maybe not tsunamis, I went too far there. But Puerto Rico is a perfect example of what we need to think about when we talk about our vulnerabilities here in the state. Power's been out for months there. We just had front page stories about students in schools celebrating the return of power after 3 months being out. That's something we need to be cognizant of because obviously we're an island state similar to Puerto Rico. We need to be able to rebuild not only after a disaster, something which is resilient and a grid which is resistant to this sort of risk, but also be able to proactively get there and make the investments that we're making today in that infrastructure to be able to be prepared for this sort of thing. Clearly, somebody called for Tesla and apparently they showed up. Maybe we can do something along those lines in partnership with our utilities and other folks to start thinking outside the box a little bit quicker than I think we are currently planning for, because it could be tomorrow that we find ourselves in the same spot. We've got in Hawaii enormous vulnerability, and this is an El Nino year, to hurricanes. We've got about 15 per year in this kind of year that narrowly miss us, thankfully, but you never know what's coming next. A direct hit is a $40 billion loss that's projected to our economy. And for our grid, we are certainly a little bit less prepared than we probably need to be. We have a lot of overhead transmission and distribution, which is vulnerable to flying debris and all sorts of things. We've got coastal generation, which is extremely vulnerable to storm surges and sea level rise and everything else that comes with it. And the thing is, it's nobody's fault that we're here and stuck in this situation, but it will be if we do nothing and ignore the risk. And that's why it's on us to have this conversation in the context of our changing climate and of what we can do to change our energy future and carbon emissions. And so at the legislature this year, we passed already out of the House to the Senate and some out of the Senate to the House, bills which would require the PUC, although we know they're already going this direction, to look at microgrids and the benefits they can have for resiliency, to look at the kinds of infrastructure upgrades that would really provide some measure of protection against these kinds of events. We've got money we really want to set aside to deal with critical infrastructure, our police stations, fire stations, hospitals, emergency response centers, to make sure that they're online when everybody else is not, at the very least. And for us, we want to make sure that there's opportunity for collaborative discussion and competitive planning. We know that places around the country, states like Maine, other regulatory markets have engaged in this sort of process where you're not just asking one entity to look at a potential fix to a resiliency problem, but rather you're bringing in everybody and opening it up and letting that discussion and dialogue create opportunities for answers to these questions which never before existed. The most cited example probably is a project in Brooklyn, which was a transmission project, which was slated to be about a $1.2 billion upgrade, and which was opened up to a competitive thought process. And ultimately, rather than doing the traditional set of infrastructure investment, something a bit more distributed, something a bit more out of the box was finally approved, which was about $200 million. And it achieved the same result. We can do the same thing with our resiliency. We can do this sorts of things because we have a need to, and we have to. I realize I'm almost out of time, aren't I? I'm going to cut this short just a little bit, but just note that for us, we've already made investments when we think about our climate and carbon frame, but we've got a lot more to go. This is obviously Fukushima, which everybody I'm sure is familiar with. We know that we're going to be losing probably at a minimum $19 billion of coastal infrastructure here in Hawaii in the next few decades as sea levels continue to rise, as erosion begins to threaten our coastal infrastructure, but moreover, not so much that it's going to fall into the ocean and be gone and submerged, but that the incidences of 100-year events, of storm surges during hurricanes and those sorts of things are amplified exponentially as a result of sea level rise. And so it's those sorts of events more than anything that we ought to be thinking about. And so how do we deal with this when we have a lot of vulnerability and exposure, just as other places have? This is the kind of thing that basically boils down to something which you can sell to a whole school group, and we do regularly in our interactions, talking about climate change and its impacts and what we should do differently in Hawaii, and it's just stop building in stupid places, as one kid pointed out to me recently. Because ultimately, and I couldn't have said it better myself, because ultimately it just transfers risk to ratepayers. and transfers risk to taxpayers and everybody else who are at the receiving end of some of these unfortunate events. But let me wrap up by saying, if these guys get it, then it feels good because it means that we all have the capacity to get it, and we all have the capacity to do something about it. And what we're doing in Hawaii really does matter. We know renewables already here, based on our experience, can stabilize and reduce energy costs over the long term. We know that the technology exists to be able to get to 100% renewable energy. The law says 2045. Our utilities are already pushing that, in some cases saying 2040. We have studies out there just this year from reputable institutions saying actually no, 2030 is even possible if we really want it. Reality shows that we're saving money. We've already saved $250 million in just straight avoided fossil fuel costs. Renewable integration is moving along, and we're learning lessons as we go in partnership with our utilities and project developers. We're seeing consumer demand as a result rise, because everybody wants to be able to control their own destiny, and especially when there's an economic impact. And so for us, what we're seeing around the world is other places replicate what we're doing here. Solar policies, storage policies. The picture of my Facebook post with Kevin De Leon that I cited at the beginning sparked an effort and a conversation which I don't take credit for by any means, and Hawaii shouldn't. California is doing this on its own, but coincidentally, California is looking at 100% by 2045. And they're not the only state. Massachusetts, Washington, Colorado, Minnesota, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut are also in talks with us here and others around the country about how they can do the same thing. I was recently with Diane Moss and her team in Brazil, in the state of Pernambuco, which is an 11 million person population. We are on the verge of executing a memorandum of understanding between Hawaii and Brazil on that front to move together toward 100% renewable energy. That's something which has got ripple effects that we could have never imagined when we started this discussion. And I'm going to be in Mexico next week and a few other countries shortly thereafter, following up with the same conversations. Because ultimately, this planet we share, and it's the one thing that ties us all together. The Paris Agreement that we saw when it comes to carbon, greenhouse gases, and climate is unprecedented. Virtually every every country on the planet, save one. But when it comes to implementation of the policies and practices and actual boots on the ground technology to get us there, Hawaii is one of those places that's leading the way. And here in Hawaii, whether it's electricity, transportation, our climate efforts, there is one thing that ties all of that together, and that's overall our carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. That is what brings all these silos of effort across the board together. It's the underlying driver behind everything we do, and it's time we begin focusing more clearly on those efforts to boost that end result, to better benefit our economy, our environment, and ultimately our way of life. And that's why I'm so excited that we're all here today to have that discussion. Thank you very much. All right, let the grilling begin.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Representative Lee, for that great speech and overview of Hawaii's energy progress so far. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Gavin Bade. I'm the senior reporter at Utility Dive. We're an electric utility trade publication based in Washington, D.C. And I'm here because Representative Lee is right. The entire country is watching what you're doing in Hawaii and how you're getting through this clean energy transition. And this is my third time out at the conference, and I do it because I know that our audience in the electric utility industry across North America is keyed in to how you guys are making decisions about renewable energy, how you're making decisions about decarbonization, and how you're making those decisions benefit Hawaii residents as a whole. So I'm always very excited to come out here and kind of take the pulse of the leading edge of the energy transition in the U.S., because that's really what you are. So I'm extremely happy to have the opportunity to ask Representative Lee, one of your energy leaders here, a couple questions along with Doug up here. So we'll just get started with where you left off, Representative. Everyone here, I think, could say we love wind and solar, but that's not the only reason that we go and install it, right? We install wind and solar, we focus on renewables because we care about global climate change and the threats that it presents. However, Hawaii, while it has the nation's most ambitious renewable energy goal, doesn't necessarily have a carbon-specific target to go along with it. And in some scholarly venues as well, just in the sector, when people talk about it, they wonder, oh, well, will Hawaii increase its greenhouse gas emissions as it goes to 100% renewables? Maybe not more than what we see today from the big fuel oil plants, but as you integrate biomass, other emitting renewable resources, they wonder, oh, is Hawaii actually going to get to zero carbon when it gets to 100% renewables? It seems like you're thinking about this as well. What are some policy considerations, some things that you guys are talking about in the legislature to make sure that 100% renewable is also 100% clean?
So I think you're right on point. I think everybody wants to make sure that not only are we doing renewables for the sake of doing renewables and building the economy and saving money and all that, but of course it's going to have a positive end result on climate change, which is obviously affecting us already and costing us a lot of money. So there's a couple things moving right now. I think as you had mentioned earlier, this past year we had launched into carbon farming discussion, which is really starting the discussion to look at what does this mean for us? What are we capable of? What is the lay of the land? And ultimately, how do we create a path forward to empower the different industries, whether it's agriculture or energy or whatever else you might have, to be able to buy into this and be able to benefit from, for example, carbon credits out of California or some other market. And so that's been just beginning. But really, I think what's coming up this year is that broader question of how do we align all our things that we're working on under this broader goal of reducing our overall impact. And I think there's a couple bills right now, one which the Senate moved out, which would create a carbon process to identify a carbon budget, which is basically what's our, as Hawaii, contribution to the overall climate situation, and how do we reduce that? And on our side, of course, creating long-term goals as well. And the exciting thing about this is, it's not saying everybody reduce your emissions to zero, which is just not practical anytime soon. But rather, if we're gonna limit what we can and be responsible for what we can, but also provide now new opportunity to be able to offset. And so we know, for example, that better soil management in ag can have significant positive impact on reducing greenhouse gases and sequestering them. So how do we take opportunities like that, which can totally grow new economies of scale in various industries, and leverage that against what we have, whether it's biofuels or other things which will continue to put some form of something in the air.
Mm-hmm. If I could just follow up, a lot of what you're talking about seems to be some sort of market for carbon credits or some sort of market mechanism like a price on carbon. However, I can tell you, coming from the mainland, I'm sure it's the same here, when you start talking about a price or market mechanisms for carbon, you always get the T word, you always get a tax, and that's something that, no one likes to pay taxes, no one likes to pay those things. Even if they might, in the end, fund programs that would be overall beneficial to the state or the society. I wonder, as you're thinking, you and your colleagues are thinking about going forward with these cap and dividend, carbon pricing schemes, how can you sell them to a public that, has kind of been primed to see these things as, big government coming in and taxing me?
Yeah, so I think to be clear, we're not there yet, by any stretch. Our tax review commission here in the state had identified one of the places of significant revenue out of this particular area as, I think, $270 million should we establish some flavor of a carbon tax. But that's not what's on the table right now. And I think while that certainly may be part of a discussion in the future, I don't know who's going to replace me down the road. And I certainly know what's coming in the next 2 or 3 years. You're welcome to have the job. I think the first thing is really, let's figure out what's real, right? I mean, what are the metrics? How do you even capture metrics in the first place? And while there are a number of different schemes for that in different states and different carbon markets, we've got to figure out what makes sense here. And we really don't have a handle on that yet. So it'll be, I think, a while before we ever get to that discussion. But I will say this, we have 2 carbon taxes, one artificial, one straight up carbon tax. The first being the fact that we've got to ship everything in. That is by far and away, I think, the largest, or is it a natural carbon tax? I don't know. It's a mechanism there which is clearly influencing our economy, and I think it's a great lesson to see how you can price out renewables and everything else in that context. The second one, of course, is our barrel tax, which has been around for some time. 2 years ago, it was expanded to encompass all fossil fuels, with coal being a little bit delayed, but we'll eventually cover all of them in the next few years. And that is something which now at $1.05 per barrel or equivalent BTUs generates, I think, about $45 to $50 million a year. And that goes into fund a number of things, which includes the Energy Office and sort of our renewable efforts here in the state.
Thing I learned, barrel tax. Doug, I think you had a question?
I just wanted to follow up a little bit. It sounds like you're thinking of perhaps a regional solution that when we talk about carbon, that we would need to be looking at some of the other more established markets, places like California. Do we have a large enough economy here that we could do a Hawaii-specific solution like we did for RPS? Or does it need to be a broader kind of regional answer on carbon?
Honestly, I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know that anybody, at least that I've spoken with, credibly does yet. Because no one's done the analysis to look at really what does our economy look like in that context. But I will say, I mean, we've had conversations with a number of other states on this front. And I think there is benefit to scale. And if you can align yourself in the end with somebody else, not only can you not have to recreate the wheel from scratch, but also you have a whole new market which is then accessible to you. So if you're a big industry somewhere in Los Angeles or on the East Coast, and you're buying credits because you're polluting over there, why not invest that money here in Hawaii? And if you're an airline, for example, to the same token, we know there's going to be a lot of international regulations which require investment to offset carbon emissions. Why not invest that here? So that's why we really want to get on the front end of this, to be able to leverage that right now and get everybody the opportunity that otherwise might go somewhere else.
Okay, I was going to ask one more. You mentioned bringing in EVs that are made other places. That's going to be part of the solution. And I guess when you talk about a carbon footprint, when you talk about embedded carbon inputs in something, are we worried if we're going to be bringing cars from China? Do we need to give any consideration to how they were produced? What are the conditions over there? Or do we just do the math based on what the impacts are for us in the islands?
It's hard to say, because I don't think anybody's really got a strong methodology to figure that out across most sectors. But I do think there's value there in knowing that. Obviously, I swam over this morning, so I had 0 carbon emissions on the way here from Oahu. But these kinds of things, right? I mean, they're not direct. They're sort of the tangential impacts and upstream costs that ultimately we're going to feel in our rising seas and everything else regardless. So I think whether we ultimately act on it or not, I think we have to acknowledge it. You can't ignore that sort of thing. And that's something which is certainly going to be part of the discussion.
Excellent. Well, I want to go to some of the questions from the audience here. We've got one here that gets at the question of equity, which I know is a big issue that we always want to talk about in these clean energy transitions. The question is, how do you balance the need to switch to renewables with the economic burden it will inevitably place on Hawaii families? Obviously, an assumption built in there that building more renewable energy will increase rates at Hiko, Miko, the other places. I think there's a flip side to that question as well, as new cost decreasing technologies come and become available to citizens, how do you make sure that those are equitably distributed among your rate base, right? We have a third of people who have some sort of distributed energy resource, solar water heaters, solar in Hawaii today, but I think everyone can agree it's not necessarily the people who are under the most pressure from the rate structure right now, right? Mm-hmm. So broadly, how do we make sure that as we move toward a lower carbon, renewables-based economy, that the people who need to benefit most are benefiting, and that they're not being given the costs of the transition in a bigger way than maybe the more affluent folks who can afford to throw solar up on their roof? Sure.
Let me take the first question.
Yeah,
first
there's a little
first.
bit there. Sorry. Yeah.
No, I can do this in 10 seconds. I think when you ask the question, how can we move toward renewables, should it lead to higher costs and so forth, I look at it as how can we not move that direction when we know there is significantly higher risk to ratepayers by sticking with fossil fuels over the long term. Because we know at the very least, investment in a renewable project stabilizes energy prices. It's a flat cost. You're not paying for a commodity, you're paying for the investment on the front end. Clearly, what we've seen thus far, and there's so many examples of investments which over the long term, of course, save money, and I think that's reflected in a lot of the utilities filings around the state, clearly looking at long-term planning and investment, which over that time period will stabilize those costs, reduce volatility, and ultimately save money in that respect. To the second part of your question, I think is the trickier part. Who's responsible for making those investments and who's responsible or are going to be the beneficiary of these changes in the grid. And I think when you look at the traditional, is it someone who's fairly wealthy who can afford the upfront costs for solar, batteries, and all that, versus someone who may not be able to? That's where I think it is on us, it is on government and on the regulators and the PUC and so forth to be able to ensure that those investments are being benefited or are benefiting everybody. And I think right now there's been a lot of to this point subsidy and support for a lot of these kinds of technologies, and that's great because it gets them out there. But now the question is, how do we ensure that benefit translates to everybody? So I mentioned earlier we've got, I think it was 60 megawatt hours of storage that was put on in residences around the state in the last 12 or so months. Now it's on the PUC and us to make sure that the rate structure and the rate design for those customers encourages them and incentivizes them to make that storage available to the broader grid. It's one of those days. Yes.
Just quickly, do you think that going out to 2045, Hawaii will be able to get to 100% renewables with the set of resources that are considered renewable in Hawaii today? Or is there going to have to be some tinkering with that definition, some tinkering with the law?
No, I mean, I think it's broad enough that we definitely can get there. I mean, I was talking with somebody at NREL the other day about this, and there's a number of folks who've done these studies looking at resource mixes and how they can apply island by island. But it's clear that for us here, for electricity, we can definitely get there. Mm-hmm. I think for transportation, it's a little bit more difficult when you think about jet fuel, and if for example, you're going to acknowledge and try and do something about those sorts of transportation costs, which aren't direct, both for people or commodities. But it is the kind of thing that folks like Pacific Biodiesel and others are looking at. And I think while we don't know today what that's going to be, there are bills moving this year to further that conversation and help promote that so we can get there and get something of scale, which may not be viable economically for everyone this year or next, but hopefully in 5 or 10 years will.
I'm going to go ahead and combine a couple of the questions from the audience, and we're starting to run out of time, so I'm going to ask you all these together.
All right, one-word answers.
They're all transportation related, and so first, what specifically, is there any additional legislation you'd like to see to encourage EV adoption, and is part of the barrel tax funding possibly available for this? Is some of the money that goes to the general fund, could that be reallocated? And then finally, related, are there any specific examples on how to integrate transportation planning, into what we're doing so far?
Yes. There we go. No, so there's a lot of funding, obviously, that's coming through the barrel tax. I think there is opportunity for leveraging more of that into the EV transportation area. And I think when it comes to common resources, so commonly available charging in particular, we've had real headaches in the past with discussions trying to figure out how do you get a condo or an apartment building, an association to be able to finance some of this stuff, right? Because some members will benefit, others will not. It doesn't benefit the entire public. But when it comes to common stuff, which you can do geographically or in other ways, I think there's definitely benefit there. It's being experimented with right now in Southern California and other places. And I think we have significantly more benefit per capita here because we're so dense in moving some of the dollars that way and creating those sorts of nodes of saturation throughout urban areas.
So, ladies and gentlemen, let's have a round of applause for Representative Lee.
I've got one more question for the representative before. This is the Washington journalist in me. I got to get you while I got you,
Fake news.
Fake news. Well, we'll see. We'll see. You're obviously young, up-and-coming Democratic politician in Hawaii. You're making a lot of waves out here, no pun intended.
I'm not running for anything else right now.
When am I going to see you in the halls of Congress with me in Washington?
That was the question.
Or are you more of a Honolulu type of guy?
I am more of a Honolulu type of guy. I don't think I've said this publicly before. You know, there was a time in the past few years when it was widely expected there would be vacancies in Congress, as there now are, apparently, that I had looked at what sort of things could be done in DC, and would I be able to do something significant that makes it worthwhile? Because frankly, the commute sucks. And
It does.
sitting around raising money 5 hours a day on the phone, 5 days a week, forever, not only for yourself, but because in order to be able to do anything meaningful, you've got to be able to fundraise for your colleagues to get them to help pass your stuff. That is not appealing. And I've been doing this for 10 years now, and it's cost me relationships and time with family and friends, and it's hard sometimes. But if I'm going to keep doing this, I feel like not only would I want to do it and make it worthwhile for me, and hopefully everybody who's out there that would support me, but I'd want to do it here, at least for now, because I feel like, frankly, you can make significantly more difference here in Hawaii. And for us, I think this is where the need is. I mean, yeah, we can go to DC, bring back more money, and I don't want to say anything that would devalue what our congressional delegation is currently doing. But the real impact that we can have is right now at the state level, and I think will be for a little while longer. And so if we are in a place where we are leading a discussion on these issues, and I care about these issues, you know, climate and energy and this stuff, I mean, this is transformational. This is about our future, and it's about hopefully one day my kids' future if I ever get time to have a family. I think this is where that time is best spent. And I cannot, and I've thought about this a lot, I cannot walk away from that. I feel like I'd be throwing away the opportunity we have to actually do something that not only will have profound impact here in Hawaii, but is clearly being replicated in other places around the world. And that's something which no amount of pomp and circumstance in DC and all that stuff will ever be able to match.
So Hawaii for now.
Yeah.
So thank you all around, and we're going to go ahead and take a break now. Thanks, folks.